Our next guest is Representative Brenda Carter, representing Michigan's 53rd Congressional District out of Pontiac, a Democrat who is also the co-chair of the Michigan Firearms Safety and Violence Prevention Caucus. Representative Carter, appreciate you joining us today, albeit wishing it was under better circumstances.
Tyler, thank you for inviting me today.
So first off, I just want to inquire about your initial reaction when you received the news last night, initially out of East Lansing, when this tragedy began just shortly before 8:30 last night.
Tyler, as an alum of Michigan State University, walking from Berkeley over to the U, many times being over in the Union Hall, I was total disbelief and then disgust, because we have been working so very hard with the caucus to ensure that another Oxford didn't happen in Michigan again. And unfortunately, we go through this trauma. I'm here in Lansing right now, and my colleagues are just in deep remorse because this is a situation that we could have done something about.
And so let's dive into that a little bit deeper. Again, you're the co-chair of the Michigan Firearms Safety and Violence Prevention Caucus. Talk about how that group came together and what work they are doing or continue to do it in the discussions that they're having at the legislative level to attempt to bring some of this legislation forward and maybe try to find a legislative and a policy solution to some of these issues that keep popping up across the U.S., including, unfortunately, here in Michigan, multiple incidences in the last 2 years.
And Tyler, thank you for asking that. Senator Rosemary Bear and I, we both shared a similar district or similar in a community of Pontiac. Senator Bear experienced suicides in her family, and unfortunately for me, I lost a son and a nephew to gun violence. Or my son, he died a year later after being a victim of gun violence. So it's very, very personal for us. But we started this about 2 years ago. And during that time, we watched gun violence escalate, not only in Michigan in our urban centers, but across the nation with unfortunate shootings like in Buffalo and Uvalde. We just felt that we needed to do something. So we were working under a different majority at that time, but we had bills that we knew that if we were able to pass those bills, the situations like East Lansing would not have occurred. So that's how we started. That's why we started. And that's why we are working with urgency, with a sense of urgency now to make sure that an event like this doesn't happen in Michigan again.
And it's sad because when these things happen, we think about, or we try to connect them to what we know, to what we've already experienced, and try to learn from that point. And it's tough not to connect the shooting at Michigan State University last night to the Oxford High School shooting in November of 2021. And again, calls for progress, calls for change immediately at the beginning of the shooting last night and all the way throughout the unfortunate end with 3 deaths and 5 others hospitalized in Sparrow Health System right now in the Lansing area. So from someone that's been in the legislature, it was in the legislature during that time of the Oxford High School shooting and is in the legislature even now in the wake of the shooting at Michigan State, what progress, if any, has been made in Lansing on this issue in those last almost 2 years?
Well, unfortunately I have to state in the last session, the last 2 years of the session, no progress was made. None. We submitted the bills. We never got a hearing. It was just like it didn't even matter. But now we have an opportunity for huge change. And if you were able to listen to the governor's State of the State address, she highlighted 3 areas that she thought would be very, very important to pass into law this session as quickly as possible. And those were safe storage, background checks, and red flag laws. Now, these laws are very important because if any of these laws had been in place, maybe, just maybe, particularly with the red flag law, maybe East Lansing would not have occurred. So, what's the difference now between the previous session? We truly have an opportunity to implement common sense gun reform. We're not talking about violating anybody's Second Amendment rights. We're talking about putting common sense reform legislation in place that we can mitigate and deter incidents like what happened last night.
Representative Brenda Carter is with us on today's edition of the Megacast, a Democrat from the city of Pontiac, representing Michigan's 53rd congressional district in the House of Representatives. And as you mentioned, that is a common phrase we hear, particularly from the Democratic Party when discussing issues of gun violence in our country and here in the state of Michigan. They say common sense gun reform or common sense gun control. Define that for us. That's a pretty broad term and often isn't really broken down too much by our leaders when they mention it. So break it down for us, Representative.
What we mean is that there's an argument out there that any reform would take away or violate Second Amendment rights for responsible gun owners. That is not the case. We're looking at things that if we know that someone has a background history of violence and gun violence, putting something in place to kind of mitigate that, to stop that. Or if we know that there's a history of a person having domestic violence issues, then maybe we should have something in place that will flag those incidents that person has. It's looking at what the history of the person is doing and putting some safe checks in place. Our gun owners out there who use it for recreation, that loves and respects the law, we're not concerned with them. We're concerned with the young man who went out to Michigan State and for whatever reason took the lives of 3 people and injured 5. These are the people we're talking about. Common sense. It's common sense to know that if you purchase a gun without a waiting period, that it's a possibility that something may happen, especially if you haven't been flagged. Okay, so these are common sense gun reform. Just looking at the situation and putting something in place that will hopefully deter a situation like East Lansing.
As it currently stands, it would take a felony gun charge typically to be flagged for being to be a potential risk in purchasing a gun. And in the case of the shooter last night, who was not apprehended, was approached by law enforcement just north of campus and ultimately took his own life. According to a report from Bridge, Michigan, in front of me, he was arrested in 2019 for possession of guns without a concealed carry permit. That according to Michigan Department of Corrections spokesperson Chris Gautz. And the court records show that he was initially charged with a felony, which would have put him in a position to be flagged should he have purchased another gun, and later took a plea deal that broke that down to a misdemeanor. What are the chances of something of that sort of a situation being addressed at the legislative level as you look toward these quote-unquote common sense gun reforms that, maybe in these cases people will be calling for, well, if someone's been charged with a gun crime before and especially convicted even as a misdemeanor, why wouldn't that pop up as something that should be a red flag, if not initially, then altogether, and say this person may not be that, as you mentioned, responsible gun owner?
And Tyler, I think the priority piece of legislation that we're working on, and I know it's happening on the national level, is universal background checks. Okay, right now, Michigan has some of the weakest laws as it comes to common sense gun reform and universal background checks. If it was a requirement, if it was part of law, part of statute, maybe just maybe we would have caught some of the things Bridge Magazine noted in that article. But because we have so many lax policies on guns, it's loopholes that we need to close. So that's what we're working on right now. I know that it's a high priority for our caucus, and I know that it's a high priority for the governor. So I'm very optimistic. Now we will see some common sense gun reform.
I would be remiss not to briefly take the perspective of those that may not be in the same camp as you on this particular issue, particularly on the gun reform, specifically those responsible gun ownerships that do take issue with this sort of legislation being proposed, being discussed, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level. What do you have to say to those individuals who are responsible gun owners, who do store their guns properly, who do utilize their guns and concealed carry properly and go through those right avenues, who may be concerned that these sort of events may lead to legislation that could be, for lack of better terms off the top of my head, restrictive to those responsible or presumably future responsible gun owners?
First of all, I'd like to thank them for being responsible gun
Of
owners
course.
and know that the legislature do recognize them as responsible gun owners, and we're doing everything we can not to infringe upon their right to enjoy their firearms for the recreational purposes that they use them for. But I want to assure them that it's not the scope of this legislation to be punitive to responsible gun owners, because we recognize that you're doing what is needed to be done by anyone that possesses a firearm, and that's to be safe with what you're doing and not cause harm or injury to innocent people.
And at this time, you do have a full majority in both chambers of the legislature. Governor Whitmer is also in your caucus on the Democratic, as a Democrat too. And gun violence, gun reform. This is a tentpole issue for your party. Given those majorities and your ability to move legislation through the processes to get them on the House and the Senate floor and get them in front of the governor, especially given what happened on Monday, how much more of a priority do these sort of common sense gun reforms, as you say, as you mentioned earlier on, how much more of a front seat do those take now, especially given the circumstances in our legislature and the urgency that the public certainly has at this time, given the tragedy in East Lansing on Monday?
Well, first of all, I want to do say that it is of extreme urgency for our caucus to move this legislation forward, but we are looking for input from the public. This is something we're taking, actually gauging our actions from the reactions of the public. So the public is going right along with us, guiding us to what we feel or hope to have as sensible gun reform. Yes, we are anxious, but we are deliberate. So we're going to be looking at all the things that could affect this pro and con to ensure that we deliver legislation and laws that are amenable to everyone in the state of Michigan. I would just say that for my responsible gun owners again, we need your input as well to ensure that we craft legislation that's inclusive of everyone. But know that this is of the highest priority now, because it was only 14 months ago that we were here with Oxford.
Representative Carter, thank you very much for joining us. Before I let you go, I just want to give you one more opportunity to say anything you'd like to at this moment, or any lasting words for your local community, for your constituents in the 53rd District, in our local area, around the Pontiac area of southeastern Michigan, and of course to our fellow MSU alums and those in the Michigan State community.
Um, it's rare that I get choked up like I am right now. I went to Michigan State University, and MSU campus is one of the most beautiful campuses in the world where you could be free. And I just want my fellow alums, the students at MSU, to know that you have our deepest condolences, not only for our victims and the ones that are still in the hospital, but for our students who now wake up and realize that this tragedy has happened at MSU. We are very sorry for this, and we're going to do everything we can within the legislature to stop this from happening again. Enough is enough.
Representative Carter, thank you very much for joining us.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me.